Okay, so in our next topic, we'll be looking at Buddhist devotional practices. Now, the Buddhist word for this is puja, and this word can be translated perhaps most simply in English as worship, or perhaps something like devotional ritual. Now, this links to the topic we did on Buddhist places of worship. So you might kind of think that Buddhists, the places are where Buddhists worship, and puja is how Buddhists worship. And so these different practices could be done at the kind of places we learnt about, so temples, monasteries, or in the home. Now, Buddhists worship in a variety of different ways, but in this topic we'll be looking at 4 ways in particular, and they're the only 4 ways you need to know about for your GCSE. And so the ways are chanting, mantra, malas, and mudras. And it is worth saying that, one Buddhist, it's not a question of choosing between them. One Buddhist might do all 4 of them at different times, or as we'll see in future lessons, actually, you might use malas, for example, while you're also reciting a mantra. But in this video, we're going to look at chanting. We're going to look at what chanting is, why Buddhists chant, and the reasons why chanting is an important Buddhist practice. And we're also going to look at some examples of Buddhist chants. And if you think about the why and why it's important, that obviously links to a 5-mark question might be explaining why Buddhists chant, and an 8-mark question might be explaining why chanting is important. So let's get started with chanting. Chanting is a practice which has a long history in Buddhism. In fact, it's probably as old as Buddhism itself. And it's performed in all schools of Buddhism. So it's not a case of, Mahayana Buddhists chant and Theravada Buddhists don't, or vice versa. What chanting is when we repeat words or phrases in a rhythmic kind of way, but usually without any kind of tune or melody. In Buddhism, chanting can be done individually, so you could do it on your own, or you could do it as a group. So groups of monks might chant together. And we will in a lesson kind of hear some Buddhist monks chanting together, okay? In terms of what Buddhists chant, commonly this is Buddhist texts, Buddhist teachings, or it could be expressions of respect, for example, to the Buddha. And the last thing is that Buddhists, when they chant, sometimes they chant in what you'd call a vernacular language. So it might be, your home language, like it might be English. But very commonly, Buddhists use ancient languages in their chanting. So Pali, for example, or it might be old forms of Tibetan in Tibetan Buddhism. So these are 3 Buddhist chants. Now, I think for your GCSE, you don't, you're not going to need to know them off by heart or anything like that. Although, as you might be able to see from this slide, some of them will look fairly familiar anyway. So the first one that you might see is called the Triratna, or the 3 refuges, which is also known, the 3 refuges are also called the 3 jewels. And it's worth saying that this one is on the specification for your exam board, so you do need to know this one. Now, the 3 refuges are maybe the kind of 3 foundations of Buddhism, and the 3 things that support and guide Buddhists in their search for enlightenment. So they're the Buddha, so that could be the historical Buddha that we learned about his life, Siddhartha. But when we talk about the Buddha, for some Buddhists that might also be a particular bodhisattva. The Dharma is the second one, and the Dharma is the Buddha's teachings, and the Sangha is a third one, and that's a kind of Buddhist community, perhaps particularly including the Buddhist community of monks and nuns. And so in this chant, Buddhists sort of chant 3 times for each of them. They take these things as their kind of refuge. So again, think about that in terms of their foundation. The second one, which you can see, is the 5 precepts, which we've come across before in lessons. But Buddhists might chant the 5 precepts, and particularly they chant kind of almost a commitment to uphold the 5 precepts, and that's commonly done 3 times. And the third one you can see is quite a short chant, but it's one expressing respect for the Buddha. Again, that's done 3 times, and it's very commonly done as the kind of first chant before anything else. So it's kind of a way of starting off. So let's look at why Buddhists chant. Now, if you're a very switched on kind of person, you might have noticed that I've made a little mnemonic for this just to help us remember it. And handy enough, our mnemonic actually spells chant. And just kind of remember that kind of the purpose of these mnemonics is hopefully for a 5-mark question, you'd need to know 5 key points. And so a mnemonic kind of helps us remember those. Okay. So think about why Buddhist chant. Well, the first point is that Buddhist chant kind of create a sense of calm awareness. And it might help here to kind of think about when Buddhist chant. And very commonly it's done when you might perhaps enter a place of worship, or when you're starting a religious ceremony, or if you're about to begin a period of meditation. And so it kind of links, this kind of links then to our first point. Like I say, Buddhist chant to create a kind of sense of calm awareness, and that's the kind of C of our mnemonic. The second reason is that chanting helps Buddhists remember key texts, because as it happens, chanting is actually a really good way of kind of memorising information. So old that I am now, I can kind of clearly remember 30 years ago when I was at school chanting like Latin verb endings, and to this day I can still remember bam bas bat, barmas bartis bant, because we had to chant that as a class over and over again. So it's a really good way to memorise information. Now this was particularly important in early Buddhism, because as far as we know historically, the Buddha lived in a culture that simply did not have writing, and that meant that for really hundreds of years, the only way to preserve and pass on the Buddha's teachings was for monks individually and as groups to chant out the Buddha's teachings, over and over and over again, to make sure it was remembered accurately. Obviously, Buddhists today do have writing, so the Buddhist teachings have been written down for many hundreds and in fact thousands of years. But even today, it is kind of seen as important for Buddhists to actually remember Buddhist text. Our third point is about awareness and self-awareness. And if you think back to the chant which I showed you about the 5 precepts, perhaps it might help to kind of give you an example. So Buddhists, when they chant the 5 precepts, that might kind of help them be aware of their own practice and whether they're living up to that. So for example, you might kind of feel that one of the precepts is abstaining from false speech. Well, perhaps when you're chanting that, it just might kind of remind you about that time when perhaps recently you've said something a bit hurtful and not quite true, and that might kind of motivate you to just to strive to be a little bit better. Okay, and that's the A in our mnemonic. And the N stands for not prayer. Now, mostly I kind of put this in because I really need an N to make chant, to make it nice and neat. But I think it is worth perhaps saying that the role of a Buddhist chant is not the same as the role of praying in a theistic religion like Christianity. So instead, the aim of chanting is a kind of to bring about an internal transformation rather than asking some external God to transform you, if that makes sense. And the 5th point links to the 3 refuges of the Triratna, which, as I say, you kind of are expected to know for your GCSE. And that's the idea that when Buddhists chant that, it's kind of a recommitment to their religion. And so, in fact, the way you kind of become a Buddhist and you kind of express that you have become a Buddhist is to take the 3 refuges. So to say that you commit to taking the Buddha as your refuge, the Dharma as your refuge, and the Sangha as your refuge. And so Buddhists chant this chant again very, very commonly at the start of a period of meditation or at the start of a religious ritual. So it's almost like them kind of recommitting to the Buddhist path almost every time they practice it. Okay. And lastly, we can look at why chanting is important. And so again, I'm kind of sticking with my chant mnemonic. And if you think that for an 8-mark question, a good technique I think to use is to have 4 kind of key points, which could be kind of 4 bits from our mnemonic, each of which is kind of backed up with a good kind of explanation. And so what I've tried to do here is to link the mnemonic to different aspects of the Eightfold Path, because it's the Eightfold Path that guides Buddhists to Nirvana. And I kind of think in your exams, perhaps a good way to approach some of these 8-mark questions is to be making links back to key teachings, and particularly in Buddhism where everything kind of connects back in together anyway. So in terms of why chanting is important, well, if we think about the idea of creating calm awareness, you could say that's important because it supports or it cultivates right concentration, which is one of the parts of the Eightfold Path. And so the idea is it's kind of getting you into the right frame of mind so you're then ready for a period of meditation. Okay. The next one with the helping remembering texts is, I think you could say that's important because it helps cultivate right understanding. And as a reminder, right understanding is the idea that you understand the world correctly from the Buddhist point of view. And so by remembering, off by heart key Buddhist texts and key Buddhist teachings, you're actually kind of internalizing them as a worldview. The next one for awareness, again, I think you say that's important because it cultivates right action, which is one of the steps of the Eightfold Path again. And with right action, that's the idea of acting ethically. So again, if the kind of awareness you have of your own actions through your chanting, that might support you in living a more ethical life in the future. I'm kind of going to skip the next one just for a second and say that the three refuges are important because they cultivate right thought or right intention. Because it's this idea of recommitment, and so right intention is for Buddhists the idea that you intend to kind of set out on the Buddhist path to enlightenment, and so recommitment kind of cultivates that again, or recultivates it, you might say, because like I say, every time Buddhists meditate, they might, if they chant, just kind of restate that intention or kind of recommit to it. And the last one you could move, so I'm kind of going back up one, because I think perhaps it's slightly less important. So perhaps if I was to pick four of these, it might be the four I've already mentioned. But the idea of it being an internal transformation rather than a prayer, you could say that's important because it links to kind of cultivating right effort. So trying in the right kind of manner and having a sincere commitment to sort of transform yourself. So that's Buddhist chanting. I hope you enjoyed your video. And if you didn't, I hope you at least made thousands and thousands of notes. Don't forget, there will be a quiz. Goodbye.